what we can offer is we can say, NativeScript is completely free and open source, which appeals to a lot of developers.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of React Native Radio. Today we're joined by Jed Watson.
Hey everyone.
Peter Pikarczyk.
Hey guys.
And I'm Nader Dabbit. I'm joining you today live from London, where I'm here for the Angular Connect conference. Today we are joined by TJ VanToll. TJ, before we get into discussion about NativeScript, can you give us a little information about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, name is TJ VanToll. I have about sort of a decade of experience in development and sort of been all over the place. Before I did web development, I did some time as a Java developer. So I have some Oracle certificates with some acronyms on it, and did some time as a COBOL developer, which is probably the thing I'm the most proud of. But I spend most of my time doing web development. I've been doing that for about sort of 7 or 8 years now. Spent some time working on jQuery. I've been working on jQuery UI for about 2 or 3 years. And for the last 2 years, I've been working at Telerik, and which, if you're not familiar with Telerik, we're primarily known for sort of our UI tooling that sort of spans across different ecosystems. So Kendo UI for the web, which I've worked on some. We have some Cordova tooling. And then recently, and sort of why I'm here today, is NativeScript, which I've been sort of working on for the last year or so.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this is React Native Radio. We are a show specifically about React Native, but being that NativeScript and other compiled to, I guess, native frameworks out there are probably in the interest of a lot of us, we're kind of going to veer off today and give a little discussion about NativeScript. So can you give us like maybe an elevator pitch of why people should use NativeScript?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we really need a term that sort of talks to like the category of like JavaScript to build native app types apps, because we need a good buzzword. But at a high level, you're right that if you were sort of taking and classifying sort of JavaScript frameworks out there for building apps, you would certainly put React Native and NativeScript in the same bucket. Sort of both are application or sort of frameworks that leverage JavaScript virtual machines to basically let you use JavaScript to write truly native apps. So if you're familiar with React Native, you probably know what NativeScript apps look like, because in both cases, you're building truly native UIs. There's no browser, there's no web view, anything like that. So they're sort of at a high level, there's a lot of similarities between React Native and NativeScript, but sort of the implementation, there are some differences between how the two work. And I'd say the single biggest difference between the two from a sort of architectural standpoint is that NativeScript takes the extra step on top of React Native of giving you access to iOS and Android APIs directly from JavaScript, that is. And so what that means is, let's say you're in an iOS app and you want to show an alert, and there's an iOS app called UI Alert. Well, in NativeScript, directly within your JavaScript code, you could just type new UI alert, and NativeScript would know how to interpret that, know how to instantiate that appropriate object, and to actually show an alert on the screen. So what's cool about that is that you get to stay in JavaScript. So when you need to do any of these sort of iOS or Android-y things that actually dive into the native stack, you don't have to go into Xcode. You don't have to go into Android Studio to do these tasks. You could stay directly within JavaScript, stay directly within the editor that you're most comfortable with, the development environment you're comfortable with, and use that to do these native things on these different platforms. Does that make sense at all?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really cool. Something I've been wondering about with NativeScript, and I know that it gives you access to the sort of lower level APIs as compared to React Native. I'm wondering if that's something that happens with introspection, and is it a build time with the platform, or is it something that happens at runtime? How does that sort of aspect of it come together?
Yep. Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, I love giving this answer because I think the architecture behind this is pretty cool. And the example I like to give is if you think of how, say, a web browser uses a JavaScript virtual machine. So take JavaScript Core, which React Native and NativeScript both use on iOS. Well, Safari uses JavaScript Core as well. But Safari needs a way to tell JavaScript core sort of what the window object is and what the document object is, because those things aren't a part of JavaScript core because they're not a part of JavaScript. They're not in the ECMAScript specification. They're things that are specific to the browser object model, or basically how browsers work and how the web works. So JavaScript core has to have APIs to let you do things like register global variables and sort of define the behavior of how those global variables work and sort of have callbacks so that you can take action upon those. So in the browser tells the JavaScript VM things about how window and document work and all of these things. You look at other examples like Node.js uses V8 and it has instantiates or sort of injects some node-specific behavior. And NativeScript does the same basic sort of thing, except the difference is NativeScript is actually injecting sort of Android and iOS APIs. So to give the UI alert example from earlier, that's how NativeScript actually makes those APIs available directly in JavaScript. So to kind of get back at your question then and to build upon that, you'd asked about, well, how does it actually know these APIs? If you look on GitHub, github.com/NativeScript, you'll see that we have two separate processes that are known as, we call them metadata generating processes. But they do exactly as sort of you were saying. They use sort of introspection, or it's the reflection APIs in Java. And I'm not sure exactly what the process is for Objective-C. But basically, we build up a map of here's iOS, right? Like every API in iOS and every API in Android. And we take that map, we turn it into some bytecode format. I'm not sure the specifics of how that works. And then those get injected at build time so that you don't sort of incur the cost at runtime of doing that generation. It just sort of gets injected into the app so that we can reference it at runtime.
So to follow on from that, one of the really cool things coming from a Cordova background that React Native gives you is this really lightweight and accessible bridge between, truly native code, so on iOS written in Objective-C or Swift, and the JavaScript. Like there's this really nice thin layer. But my understanding of NativeScript is that you wouldn't even need that. How does that aspect of it work? Like, is it as simple as dropping in, a new Cocoa pod and it's immediately available for you to access when you're developing?
Yes. So there is no bridge because the APIs are just there. They're sort of just available in the runtime for you to access and use directly. And if you look like sort of, we have this sort of, there has to be some sort of marshaling between the two because obviously you can't just take, Objective-C has sort of constructs that JavaScript doesn't, and the same thing in Java. And so our docs kind of walk through sort of the trickier cases of how we do that translation. But for simple things, like the things you most commonly do are things like you have to set some properties, right? Like you have a button and there's some iOS property that you want to set. Well, in JavaScript, that's pretty easy. You just get a reference to the button. You say dot property name equals value to set it. Method calls are also pretty simple, just straightforward, the open close parenthesis syntax. And basically what we do is we marshal that call and figure out how to translate it to the native stack. Now, moving beyond sort of the core SDK, because by default, like our metadata processes just point at like an iOS or an Android SDK. So you can drop in other frameworks, like you can use CocoaPods, you can use iOS frameworks, you can use, say, jars on Android. Basically, to use those, we have a plugin format that you have to subscribe to. And basically, once you put things in that plugin format, the framework NativeScript itself is smart enough to run through those same metadata processes and sort of compile that into the app so that you can use the same JavaScript syntax to access those plugins, those CocoaPods, etc.
Cool. And what about it on the JavaScript side? So the other thing that's really nice as a web dev coming into React Native is that you get this sort of fully encapsulated environment where your build process is taken care of, and you can sort of drop in packages, whether they're JavaScript only or native packages from NPM. What's the development experience like on NativeScript?
Yeah, so the development experience is quite similar. There's a CLI that you use from NativeScript. And if you want to run an app, basically you just type TNS run, TNS short for Telerik NativeScript, TNS run, and then iOS or Android. And sort of the nitty gritty of the iOS and Android processes are really abstracted away from you. If you're familiar with the Cordova CLI, we're fans of Cordova as well. So the system that we use, sort of the commands and such, are basically directly what Cordova does. So you add platforms the same way the platform add command. We have the same build and run and deploy commands that you may already know from the Cordova CLI. We sort of abstract away sort of the platform nitty gritty in the same way.
And on the topic of running these things, I guess the other big thing that everyone who uses React Native is probably a huge fan of, whether they're coming from web or pure native development, is the live reloading environment that we have to work with, which is very much a web sort of development workflow ported to native. Is there something like that in NativeScript?
Yep. Yeah, because we use a similar architecture, the JavaScript is interpreted as at runtime. So there's a compile step in both NativeScript and React Native, but the compile actually isn't, at least in NativeScript, isn't affecting the sort of web, the JavaScript and CSS assets at all. Basically, all our build does is sort of move them into the appropriate places in the native app so things can be accessed. So really, we have a similar workflow that is present in React Native, where when you save a file, basically all we have to do is reinterpret that file. So from our CLI, it's the live sync command. So you have to run one command to sort of set that up. And you just run TNS live sync, you pass it Android or iOS, and you just set the watch flag, and you get the same sort of behavior where you save your code and then the result appears immediately on your device.
Yeah, very cool. And you mentioned CSS. I believe that where React Native has implemented its own layout engine based on Flexbox and this whole kind of React style sheet system, you guys have actually gone and implemented CSS as a native layout technology.
Yeah, so I'll go into a little bit of detail about how that works. So sort of in React Native, and you can all correct me if I'm wrong, but basically the React, you're sort of embedding your styles more or less directly in your React code. Is that more or less correct?
Yes, more or less.
Okay. In NativeScript, what we actually do is we sort of treat CSS as sort of its own separate entity. So more along sort of the web dev style, where your CSS is actually in a dedicated CSS file. And your UI components you can assign classes to, like you would in your web app. You can apply IDs like you would a web app, or you can just directly reference individual UI components. And we have mechanisms so that you can declare those things at an app level so that the styles sort of apply just absolutely everywhere. And then you can also apply CSS at the view level. So individual pages that you're using, you can define styles there as well. Now, what we use to actually implement that, we use sort of existing web CSS parsers so that we sort of stay true to the CSS syntax that you'd expect. You give a selector, you have your curly braces, and then your name value pairs. But obviously, we can't truly make CSS work in native apps, kind of like React Native can't either. There's some CSS properties that are either just not really possible to make work in a native context, and the other thing too is there are some properties that are theoretically possible to get working, but that would be prohibitively expensive, sort of from a performance perspective, because layout is usually one of the harder things to get right for performance. So we sort of had to strike a balance between what we make available there and what we don't. So the things that are going to be easy to apply are going to be things like color, background color, border radius for corners. We've got I'd have to look back at the docs, but we've got probably 24 things that you can apply in CSS, which are going to be sort of the most common things that you would need to use. And from there, if those things don't meet your needs, you always have the option. Since in NativeScript you can always go directly native, you're free to use any of the iOS and Android APIs to sort of get the final tweaking and get things to look exactly like you want things to look. And that's sort of oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, it sounds like the API that you've got working is very similar to the web one, where you can set up your CSS, but then if you wanted to access properties directly on class instances, then you'd be able to manipulate them directly, like the border radius of a button in iOS. You could, talk to the UI view directly in much in the similar way to the way you would talk to an element.style.border radius in HTML and JavaScript?
Yep, it's very much the same. And we actually provide the same style syntax. So you can get reference to an element and say dot style dot, say, background color equals red, for instance. But yeah, to give it a specific example of this, I was just the other day building, actually, this was about a month ago. I was building a little login form in NativeScript. And I noticed on iOS it was doing the stupid autocorrect on an email field because I was using email for a login. And obviously, this bothered me. I really have issues with autocorrect, and so I knew iOS had APIs to sort of toggle this, right? So I did a quick Google search, ended up on Stack Overflow, found the APIs. You have to like get reference to the element and say like auto correction type equals. It's iOS, so it's very wordy, but there's basically some API you can use to turn it off. And so I was able to get reference to that UI component and just directly invoke that iOS API to sort of turn it off. And it's really just that easy. But one cool thing too is that when those sort of common things come up, because this happens on Android as well, usually what we can do is we can provide an API to abstract that away. So we actually recently, I think it came in the latest release, there's now an autocorrection type attribute that you can just provide directly to your NativeScript components that sort of under the hood is doing that UI autocorrect equals none or whatever the case may be. But we can provide abstractions around these common problems as they come up.
What kind of environment do you need to develop with NativeScript as far as tooling and platform and things like that?
Yep. So you can run NativeScript on Windows, Linux, or Mac. You do need a Mac in order to do iOS builds. So we don't just because of you have to have Xcode available, and that's what the NativeScript CLI and React Native are using under the hood to do your builds. So you need a Mac to do iOS development, but you can build Android apps on Windows or Linux. So we have the command line interface for NativeScript, but we, Telerik, also offer paid tooling as well. So we have what's known as the Telerik platform. And for anyone that subscribes to the Telerik platform, we have some paid features. And one of those features involves basically an environment that abstracts away all the different sort of build config so that you don't have to worry about setting up all the Android SDKs, iOS SDKs, and all those sorts of things. So for people that are interested in that, we sort of provide an environment that all you really need is a web browser.
Okay, cool. That's very, very cool.
So if you're launching Angular 2 support with version 1.5, does that mean you can use other frameworks with this as well, or is that tightly coupled? Say I did want to bring in React, for example, or even something like Ember. Can I throw that into my NativeScript app, or do I have to work with what you give me?
So I guess I'll take a step back here. So with NativeScript, you can technically use any framework that doesn't have a DOM dependency, since you're just using JavaScript in a NativeScript app. But because of the sort of DOM dependency, it's the reason why Angular 1, for instance, wouldn't work, because Angular 1 is tied to the DOM, which is one of the reasons that we're starting to integrate Angular 2 as an option. So the answer to that is kind of complicated, because if there is no dependency on the DOM, then a framework should be able to work. But there might be other tweaks that we might need to make. Angular 2, for instance, has some sort of specific syntax that you have to use. And so we have had to make some changes to sort of incorporate that syntax into NativeScript. Tossing frameworks in directly, like if you wanted to use React, we would need to do a little bit of work to make things like sort of the JSX syntax compatible and that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, the first thing that came to mind was Meteor, for example, and I was just wondering if it works the same way, or if you do have the ability to, choose the framework that you want to go with.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be a bit of work if you want to choose your own framework. That's something that we'd probably have to make internal changes to support. But you should have the ability to sort of use NPM modules that are sort of more utility modules, things like moment or underscore or Lodash. Those sort of things you should be able to use without any issue. But the actual framework, we'd probably in most cases need to make some internal changes to support that. But we're certainly open to doing that sort of thing, and you're welcome to ask for that or to propose that idea on GitHub.
Cool.
So what do you guys think of React?
We like React. I mean, we look at React Native. I've used React Native, and we think it's pretty cool. I mean, if anything, it's kind of fun that both we, Telerik, and Facebook with React developed a framework that has sort of a similar high-level implementation. It's sort of a good verification of this as a legitimate model to build apps, because I know sort of when we first started this, we wondered, well, would people consider this like a hack, right? Like using JavaScript to build native apps. People immediately get skeptical, or at least they did, especially when you talk to the people who do native development full time, like your like real nitty gritty iOS and Android people. They sort of scoff at the idea of taking this sort of approach. But especially with both us and Facebook and sort of the hype that Facebook's been able to build around React Native, that we're finding that we don't have to necessarily fight that fight anymore or have that conversation, that now people are sort of accepting that, hey, you can use JavaScript to build native apps. You can do so without some sort of horrible drop in performance. And this is actually a very legitimate approach that people can take.
Agree with you completely. I think the conversation's moved from, JavaScript doesn't perform well enough to maybe the problems are more isolated in terms of hybrid apps to web views and the challenges there, rather than JavaScript as a language. And it's becoming quite a viable platform, whether it's on the server or in, its home on the browser, or whether in a native app. I guess a better question would have been, what do you guys think of React Native? I believe that, in January at the conference, Facebook kind of beat you guys out the door by like only a matter of weeks from memory, that you'd both been working on the same thing independently. But it seems like a really cool future might be being able to see a hybrid of the two, where React has now separated from React DOM with the .14 release. And it seems like the strength of NativeScript in the ability to expose native classes with JavaScript APIs versus, I guess, React's maybe core value proposition of the way it then manages the UI updates might sort of open up some opportunities to work together between the two frameworks.
Yep. Yeah. And it's certainly interesting, and we'll have to see where that goes in the future. I mean, for now, what I generally tell people when they ask me this question is, I'd really encourage anyone who is about to sort of embark on some sort of, about to build an app or about to start some really big project, is to just sort of try them both out, try both approaches out, see which fits your development style. There's certainly quite a few differences in terms of the specifics and how React Native and NativeScript apps are built, that you might find one fits your sort of development approach, or that you sort of prefer a little bit better. See which one fits your use case better for what it is you're building. And yeah, in terms of timeline, earlier this year, NativeScript has been in development for about 2 years now. It's been sort of an internal project for a while. Really, to give some background, Telerik, basically, we're primarily a UI company. So we've built UIs for you name it. We've built them for the web, for Cordova apps, for Silverlight apps, actually, if you can believe that, for all sorts of things. And we've maintained iOS, Android, and Windows Phone controls for something around, I think, on top of 2 years. We've been doing those for a long time. And as you might imagine, sort of maintaining the same set of suite of UI components across these three different frameworks becomes quite the hassle pretty quickly, which is sort of how the idea of NativeScript was born. Now, when Facebook announced, I can't remember the exact month, you're correct that they announced that they were public about a month before we did. We were in a private beta before that for a few months, but it wasn't until a month after that we opened NativeScript up to everyone.
Okay. So as far as NativeScript is concerned, and I understand that it is sold as a product, or is it completely open source, or how does that exactly work? I understand the main part of it is open source, but at what point does that stop being open source?
Yep. Yeah, it's a good question. So the NativeScript CLI is, as you said, it's completely open. It's completely free and it's completely open source. you can go to github.com/NativeScript and find different information, or find basically the repos that make up the CLI, that make up our NativeScript modules, the runtimes for iOS and Android, and a bunch of other things. Now, where the sort of paid tier comes into play is really we're going to be offering two things. The first is a suite of sort of premium UI controls. So these are things that you think of more I guess, as like solutions or big controls rather than simple little things that you drop in your app. So things like graphs and charts and that sort of thing that will be available as UI for NativeScript. And that's available as a beta today, or sort of in a preview state if you wanted to check that out. The second thing is that we also have the Telerik platform, which is sort of a series of tools and services for building apps. So you could subscribe to the Telerik platform if you wanted to do things like add analytics to your app, add a backend as a service, so a place to store your data, a place to store your files, a way of sending push notifications. So we have a service that'll sort of automate all of that for you. App management, if sort of, say you have a company and you want to have an ability to distribute apps internally, say to like your QA team or to internal testers, we have a service for that. So that's sort of where the paid tier comes in with NativeScript. But for most people that are sort of just starting out building an app, you can absolutely use NativeScript for free. And if you want to implement your own things for that, if you wanted to use, say, Parse for your backend or Azure or your own thing or whatever, you're 100% welcome to do that. And we try to make NativeScript completely open for those people.
Okay, so say you had an app that you were about to put in production and you were tied to the paid tier and you needed some type of help building something. Do you guys offer support in that regard?
We do. Yep. Telerik offers, and if you go to, it's telerik.com/platform, and there's going to be a pricing link and you can get details. So we have dedicated support resources that we can sort of help you out with NativeScript or anything in our paid tiers as well. So we offer that because we found Telerik as a company, like companies, especially larger companies, that's a major thing that they're looking for. If they run into some sort of hassle, to have the ability to sort of contact us for direct assistance.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes tons of sense. It seems like it's a good business model in my opinion also.
Yep.
It totally does. I think one of the difficulties with React Native at the moment is that if you run into a problem, whilst on the platform sense, the Facebook team are very responsive to issues that come up. If you need a native module, or if you found one but you need some changes made to it, it can be quite hard to find, that expert level support on tap that a lot of larger companies really depend on to ship apps in a predictable way.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that we sort of offer the paid tier. I mean, we as Telerik certainly, the reason we're building NativeScript is we do intend to have it as this paid tier because we need to make money off the product in order to sort of develop it. And really what that paid tier does is, at least in my experience, I found that it helps when you're trying to sell the thing to a company, especially a larger company, because those companies are sort of hesitant to implement things that they don't have control of or that are just out in the open. So what we can offer is we can say, NativeScript is completely free and open source, which appeals to a lot of developers. But for companies out there, we have a total sort of suite of things that you can build on top of that. So you can use us for your backend, your analytics, your application management, and have dedicated support that goes along with it.
So as far as companies that are currently using it in production or your customers, do you have any companies that you can speak of that are already using it in production or anything like that?
None publicly, just because it's so soon. I can say that we are working with a few individuals to get apps out there, and we do have a few apps out in the store. If you go to nativescript.org, you can look at a few of the samples we have out there. But really, it's still in an early stage, especially with some of these companies. Things move a little bit slower, that we don't have anything we can publicly talk about yet.
And as far as the future plans for NativeScript, do you guys have anything in the pipeline that's worth mentioning here?
I think the biggest thing is really the Angular support that we talked about earlier. We've been working with the Google team for the sort of the greater part of this year to really incorporate Angular 2 as a first-class citizen. And really, there's a couple reasons that we're doing this. The first is for code reuse, especially a lot of people are going to be looking to learn Angular 2 over the next year or so. And so we want those people that already have that sort of skill set for knowing how to build Angular 2 views and components to be able to sort of directly translate that code into NativeScript, use those skills that they already have, and also add some ability for just direct code reuse, something that you sort of already get with React Native today, so that you could take your web code and just sort of, with minimal changes, basically be able to directly use that in your native app. And I say that's one of the things we are going to be working on, because as Angular 2 is still sort of in an alpha state, hopefully in a beta state soon, it's not something that's ready quite yet. We have code, we have a plugin out there that you can try and integrate it with today, but I mean, it's still sort of in a rough state, and that's something that we're ready to tell people, like, yes, this is ready, go use it, go forth.
Yeah, that does seem like pretty big news. I think it's going to be very interesting to keep an eye on over the next few months.
And I think the other thing worth mentioning sort of on our roadmap, and this one is a little long-term, I think it'll probably be a 2016 thing, is we are looking into adding Windows support. And so actually Windows support as an actual target, and leveraging the new Windows 10 sort of universal APIs so that you can build both Windows Phone apps and sort of apps that will run on the Windows OS itself.
That's really interesting. Does that mean that NativeScript ends up being something of a competitor to a platform like Electron?
Potentially. I think it's still a little bit early to say that, but I mean, really, the NativeScript architecture makes it possible that we can deploy to additional targets, because really all we need to do, we need to build an additional runtime that sort of is able to sort of use those reflection APIs, the metadata, to sort of make those APIs available. And then once we've done that, we can use these other deploy targets. I mean, it's theoretically possible to use NativeScript from the web and Windows and OS X, really any of these other ecosystems. But I mean, the only reason we'd be hesitant to do that is obviously each platform you add is work to sort of build and then also maintain as these platforms change and such. So we're only interested in doing it if it's something that we feel like we can do a good job with it and sort of make it robust, make it something that we can maintain. I mean, we at Telerik, especially if you're not familiar with the history of Telerik comes from a very .NET and Windows heavy background. That's sort of how Telerik made its name, especially years ago. And some of that has changed over the years. We've moved into the web, we've moved into mobile, we've moved into other ecosystems. But a lot of our customer base is still very heavy in the .NET Windows world. And especially in that ecosystem, there's a ton of requests. There's tons of people that are looking for this, that want to be able to build Windows things with NativeScript. So that's why it's something that is on our roadmap and something that we're planning on doing, like I said, in the somewhat near to distant future.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, how big is the team at Telerik that's working on NativeScript? Yeah,
so as a bit of background, Telerik, as of last year, was acquired by Progress Software. So now we're officially, I think our tag name is Telerik, a Progress company. And Telerik itself is 700-800 people, I'm probably going to say that wrong, but I think it's around that. And Progress is about an additional, say, 1,000 people. So the company overall, I mean, Progress Software is a Fortune 500 company, publicly traded. So we're probably just under 2,000 people total. So we're a fairly big company. The NativeScript team itself is several dozen people. It's hard to give you an exact number because some of the people on the team span multiple roles. So some of the people that work on say, our iOS controls may also work on NativeScript's iOS runtime. Same thing on Android. And then we have people that work on our Windows Phone controls as well. The NativeScript team is really broken up into people that work on the actual CLI. We have people that work on the NativeScript modules, which is sort of the JavaScript code that abstracts away the native APIs. And then we also have people that work on the iOS and Android runtimes themselves. So we sort of have specialists that span those multiple roles.
I think something that Facebook's been sort of promoting very prominently around React Native is that they use it in production for really large apps. And obviously their engineering clout is brought to the project in terms of support and giving it a stable future. It's really good to hear that the same thing exists at Telerik, where you've got this large company and this big team working on it. It's not exactly a David and Goliath battle between two platforms. It's Yeah, that's really cool for people who are looking at adopting it, I imagine.
Yeah, especially for companies, like having a fairly large company behind the project. I mean, we're a big company. We're not going anywhere. This isn't like a fly-by-night JavaScript framework that a handful of people threw together. I mean, this is a massive engineering effort that's been going on for many years.
Does NativeScript use anything like Babel? The first thing that came to mind when I thought Windows Phone is Internet Explorer and the experience I've had over the years. Does NativeScript have its own version of Babel, or how do you handle inconsistencies between the three engines?
So at the moment, the answer is no. We do not do any transpilation to your JavaScript code at all. And so what that means is your support for things like JavaScript APIs depends on basically the JavaScript VM that you're deploying to. So we use V8 on Android and we use JavaScript Core on iOS. We do package up the JavaScript VMs as part of the app so that you get a consistent JavaScript runtime, which is especially important on Android just because of the multitude of versions that people are using. But there are some potential slight differences between the JavaScript support that's available on JavaScript Core and V8. Now, there's an issue on GitHub that we are planning on adding direct support to our CLI to let you use both Babel and TypeScript. You can use those things today, but basically you just need to write your own little gulp script. And I think we have plugins available on NPM that'll let you do this, but you just need to write a little like grunt or gulp script that just watches your code and sort of transpiles your code from whatever format Babel uses or TypeScript into your JavaScript code as the compilation step is done. So we have people using that approach today. I've had some apps where I've used Babel as part of NativeScript, but it's not directly incorporated into the CLI quite yet.
Okay, cool.
The other thing too is for those people that do like or have used TypeScript before, using TypeScript and NativeScript, actually the NativeScript modules are written in TypeScript. So they get compiled and that they're actually JavaScript on the devices, but the NativeScript modules are written in TypeScript. And so one of the things we provide is the TypeScript declaration files. And why that's kind of cool in NativeScript is because I talked earlier about how all of the iOS and Android APIs are available. Well, that's kind of cool, but web developers especially don't know what those APIs are or necessarily how to use them. But with TypeScript, if you decide to use TypeScript with NativeScript, you get sort of the same code complete and syntax checking that you'd expect to have in, say, Xcode or Android Studio. So it's sort of especially cool in NativeScript to be able to use that and to type things like UI on iOS and just get autocomplete for all the sort of APIs that are available on iOS, or to type like Java dot space on Android just to see what's available and to get syntax checking to make sure you're sort of getting the APIs right.
Yeah, absolutely. My roommate is an iOS developer, and he lives by the auto completion. I still don't have that in Vim, but it's definitely a powerful feature.
And I've been skeptical of it myself. I've still never taken the plunge and actually used TypeScript on an app myself. And for the web, I'm just sort of too ingrained in the web to want to use TypeScript for my web apps, just because I don't feel most of the time that I need autocomplete or that it's really giving me much of a benefit. But with NativeScript, it's sort of a different beast because you're dealing with completely native apps. And so I find that just given the sort of use case and the specifics scenario, that it's actually quite nice and it's pretty beneficial, especially for working with APIs that I don't know, quite frankly.
That's really interesting. I've come from the same background and, had the same experience, I think, even though there've been IDEs that have sort of tried to do auto-completion for the web, like you've got WebStorm and, a few others that over the years have tried to give you a nice autocomplete and IDE experience. Like, I never trust it on the web.
Yep.
JavaScript is like the Wild West and you just can't assume anything. And then you watch someone who's used to writing .NET code working in Visual Studio, or you watch a native iOS developer writing in Xcode, and you're like, how does it do that?
Well, yeah, because in the web, like you type document dot, and then like you don't know like to trust like, well, is IE going to have those properties, or is Chrome? Like, you just become, you just don't trust that thing at all. Or like, how does it know what APIs are available? Because how does it know what other files you have or what other script tags you have? And it's, like you said, it's just the Wild West.
But I've extended my string prototype in this other file that you don't know about.
Yeah. But I mean, when you're talking about native apps, it's quite different, because the tooling can know exactly what you're going to have available. So in that case, it's sort of different. And I'm finding I'm slowly being convinced that I might want to try it, but I'm still hesitant and on the fence myself.
It sounds like a pretty big advantage to web developers picking up NativeScript that you've got those definitions there ready to go. I was curious, you mentioned a while back that you've used React Native. And so what are your thoughts on that? Coming from TypeScript and only having a play with it, what stood out as nice, or what didn't you like about it?
So the biggest thing I really love about React Native is just sort of the development experience. Like, I think what React Native really nailed is sort of getting up and running with your first sample is really a spectacular experience, especially in iOS. Like, you just open up the watching is by default. So you just launch up your app, you save a change, and it's automatically there. The Command R keyboard shortcut was genius, just to be able to give the same sort of muscle memory, really, that web developers already have. The same sort of developer tooling was really well done. So sort of that getting starting experience and sort of building up your first app is really cool, and something that I really enjoyed doing. And to be honest, I've said I've built things with React Native, but it's mostly just little samples. I really haven't taken the plunge and sort of actually said, yes, I'm going to build, like, say, a production quality React Native app yet. So I can't give a super thorough review.
This might be, my next question might be something that's answered by Angular more than NativeScript, but React has this whole ecosystem of other tools around it. We started out with Flux. That's been rebuilt a few times. Now we have tools like Redux and different data management patterns for handling, asynchronous updates and sort of event funneling through an app. What has NativeScript got in that sort of domain of programming?
Yeah, so it's basically integration with other things. So you're correct that part of that would be the Angular story. One thing, if you're coming to NativeScript today and you want to learn it from scratch, is we sort of have our own APIs for doing things like data binding, observables, that sort of thing. And that's one of the reasons we want to bring in Angular, so that people can use sort of APIs they already know and that are well documented, rather than sort of having to learn our APIs from scratch. So that's one example. We also have some plugins out there that'll integrate with things that you may already know. Like we have a Firebase plugin that I believe is in the works. Through our paid tooling as well, we have the Telerik backend services, which will sort of provide you integration for like things like offline. If you want your data to be offline, we have a service that will sort of cache that data on your device and know when you go back online to go ahead and just push up any necessary changes to the server. If you go to NPM and you just do a search for NativeScript, you'll find, I think we're a bit over 50 plugins now, something like that. So you can sort of peruse through that and see some of the APIs that are available. I know I just saw one pop up the other day for just sort of a Facebook login button, which is a pretty common request we have. So really our best answer to that is offering plugins for these various ecosystems.
There are 60, actually.
Oh, excellent.
Do you think it'd be fair to say that even though NativeScript and React Native are, they're both, we called them compiled to native languages at the start, which is a bit of a misnomer, but it gets the point across. Despite that sort of common architecture, it seems like React Native is a bit higher level in that you've got a bit of a walled garden around the component system and the way it reconciles the React virtual DOM to native components and bundles its own style system. You've got the escape hatch for native components that you can pull in. But it's a very kind of curated developer experience. And it seems like NativeScript is a lower level thing where, in React, you've got data binding handled by default. And in NativeScript, you would plug in Angular or something else, some other pattern to do that with. And, whereas in React Native, you're dealing with these component APIs to native objects. In NativeScript, you're dealing with the native objects themselves through this JavaScript abstraction API that you guys have built up.
Yeah, so there are other parts of NativeScript that we haven't really talked about yet. There is the NativeScript module system, which is basically gets baked into your app by default. And what our modules do, and it's actually the main NativeScript repo, so it's what's at github.com/NativeScript/NativeScript, is you'll see APIs that basically abstract away all the native ones. So there'll be, for instance, like a camera module that there'll be a camera.ios.js and camera.android.js file that sort of uses those platform-specific APIs to give you a JavaScript module that abstracts it. So you can just say require camera and then camera.takePicture. So we do think that we have a fairly big breadth of modules that abstract the most common things that you want to do in an app. So make HTTP calls, the most popular UI components, store your data. Those things are all abstracted away so that you don't have to know the Android and iOS APIs to sort of perform those tasks. And that's the other thing too, is that we're constantly looking to expand those modules and sort of what is abstracted based off user demand. So we have a user voice portal where basically you can vote for things that we're constantly looking to add to that list of things that people can do without having to learn the native code to do it. Because even though it's cool in NativeScript that you can call like UI whatever to sort of do this native-y thing, what we found is that a lot of developers just don't want to do that, right? They don't want to dig into that. So it's really kind of NativeScript's, for most things that you're doing, it's really NativeScript's escape hatch as well. We just like to think our escape hatch is a little bit easier to use because you don't have to switch context. You don't have to go into Xcode to write a little wrapper around the native code and give you an entry point to JavaScript. Basically, we just let you write that directly in JavaScript when the case comes up that you need it. I find that in the NativeScript apps that I build, really, I only have to go native for maybe like 5% of my code. And it's usually for small tweaking. Like if I need to, I find that I just call properties on UI components every once in a while, just sort of configure them. Like say the UI navigation bar on iOS, I tinker with that a decent amount. Or just to do some method call to do something that's pretty quick. But I'd say that somewhere around the area of 90 to 95% of the code I write in NativeScript is just using the modules that abstract me away from the iOS and Android specific details.
That's thanks. That's actually a really good clarification, because I think that when we talk about NativeScript and its ability to talk to the native classes directly, that's sort of the message that comes across. So it's great to hear that, that's I guess your escape hatch, and not necessarily business as usual.
Exactly. And I mean, one of the biggest battles we fight is just trying to get as many of those modules out there as quickly as we can. And that's sort of where the community comes in and where those NPM modules come in, because once we have something abstracted and out there, like we just had someone write a NativeScript text-to-speech module, so that before, if you wanted to do text-to-speech on iOS and Android, you could, right? You could like Google the APIs to do that and implement it. But now that someone has an NPM module in there, it's as simple as typing npm install NativeScript text-to-speech, and then it's like, I think it's like tts.speak or something like that. You can get your phone to say things using NativeScript.
Very cool. Speaking of native modules, there's kind of one other thing I was curious about. Back in June at React Europe, Facebook announced a whole animation solution for React Native, which is this really nice API for automating animation in the UI. And that sort of solved a whole set of problems that React Native developers have been facing. How does that, does that have a parallel in NativeScript? Do you guys have something specific for dealing with that navigation?
So in terms of animation specifically, I can't comment on the React Native specifics just because I'm not familiar with them. But we do have an animation API that came in our 1.3 release, which is about 2 months ago, I think now, where basically you get a reference to like the get element or get view by ID API. You get a reference to a UI component, and then you can just call animate on it. And so you can animate things like, I think at the moment we support, let's see if I can get this, opacity, translation, so moving things around the screen, scaling, rotation, and color changes, I believe. Hopefully I got the full list there. But basically, it's just as simple as calling animate. And we do have some sort of lower level APIs if you wanted to do things like animate multiple elements at once, or chain animations, or sort of get into easings and really get into the nitty gritty to sort of configure those APIs. We do have what sounds like a parallel of what React Native offers since 1.3. And that also, like, that was our most requested item for several months.
That sounds like a common thing between both platforms then.
Yep.
You do work on jQuery as well. Is the Animate API in NativeScript similar to the Animate API in jQuery, or am I going off in the wrong direction there thinking that?
Nope, it's actually very similar. It's .animate, and you can pass it things like duration in milliseconds. The API, I mean, it's not the same. There's some differences out of necessity. We also make our animate method return a promise so that you can chain things, which is one thing that the jQuery API doesn't do. But the core API is sort of loosely based off the best of what jQuery has.
Okay, before we wrap it all up today, if someone's wanting to learn NativeScript, what is the best way of them to go about doing that?
If you go to nativescript.org, there's a big green Get Started button. If you click that, you'll go through a little guide that walks you through building a small app with NativeScript. So you'll build a little login form and then have a list view where you just add some basic functionality. It'll take about an hour to go through, but it should teach you the basics of NativeScript and should help you decide if it's sort of a technology you're interested in.
Okay, cool. We'll definitely have to put some links to that in our show notes. So I guess we'll go ahead and jump to our picks. Peter, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. So if you haven't had a chance to see this yet, check out Ponyfoo's ES6 overview and 350 bullet points. It's a super in-depth breakdown of all the new ES6 and ES7 stuff people have been using.
Okay, cool. We'll definitely have to take a look at that. Jed?
Yeah, my pick this week is the React cheat sheet. It's reactcheatsheet.com. It's by Michael Chan. And if you've ever found yourself going back to the React docs over and over again to look up references on how do I deal with children, or what was that lifecycle method I was after, this will answer your questions with a really friendly, searchable interface that has everything grouped nicely. It's a great resource. Check it out.
Okay, my pick is going to be livecoding.tv. If you haven't checked it out, it's a really great way to pass time. It's kind of fascinating to watch other people code, just randomly jump into someone's streaming, seeing how they handle their environment and their text editor, and just it's really interesting. It's also fun to jump in there when you're in a project and have people come in and watch you and ask you questions and things like that. So we'll link to that as well. TJ, would you have any picks?
Sure. You're all picking coding examples. Now I feel like I kind of need one of those. But so I'll pick the show Outlander, which I think has been out for a while. It's a Showtime show. If you've ever asked the question, what would happen if I touched a rock and went back to Scotland in the 1700s, then this is a show for you. It's basically, that is essentially the plot. This woman just touches a stone, ends up back in Scotland, and drama ensues. So it's pretty good TV, so you should check it out.
Cool.
Okay, great. Well, TJ, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. I learned a lot, and it's really been a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
All right.